Okay, so in this lesson we'll be doing ASIC placement. We're going to have again another practice board in front of us. We're going to want to be removing and replacing up to 12 ASICs, so this will be great practice. Again, we want to make sure that we're always doing diode resistance test on the ASICs before we remove it, as well as when we reseat it. All right, so in this lesson today, we're going to go ahead and cover ASIC placement. So we need to do the top heatsink first, then we can do the back heatsink, and then we can now rework the ASICs. So let's go ahead and get started. Turn on your heat gun. This is attached by black glue on the S9. So I like to give the heatsink a little bit of a wiggle. When it's ready, it just comes right off. So this has a black glue on it. So what I like to do.
Do you mind if it's able? Yep, that's perfect. Yep, it's a better view. Thank you.
So you want to add enough heat to melt this black glue, get it soft, but we are not trying to melt the solder itself. So it just kind of comes right off the top when it's warm. You can always come at an angle to get the full top. Then you can take your tweezers, get you on the microscope here. So we want to get it off the actual feet of the pad. Again, we're trying not to scratch the board or melt the solder. You can always bring the heat back and then put it back on. Comes right off. So because it'll be easier to work some of these, I'll go ahead and work these. The first thing we want to do is set our multimeter to diode mode. As you can see, the diode symbol on the top here. So you can ground on these capacitors where there's a line. So any of these lines is ground. So we're going to take our red lead and put it on any of those. And then we're going to use the black lead and touch the test points. So we have around 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, and 0.5. So now we just add some flux. Add the heat. We want to make sure that it's nice and melted. As you can see, all the pinouts look kind of dull. They'll start to turn nice and shiny when it starts to melt. So we don't want to force it up. When it's ready, it'll be ready. So as you can see, they look nice and shiny now. And we just want to roll it up, take it off, inspect the bottom of the chip, inspect the pads of the PCB board. And we're always wanting to clean as we go. So some 99% isopropyl alcohol and a Q-tip. More flux. Now to show you what an open circuit would look like, or when you have a high reading. So ground, you can ground at the same place we did last time, doesn't matter as long as you're touching the same ground. So as you can see, it's now 0.6. Now that one's coming from the other chip, so that's why it's the same. As you can see, 0.6. So now we're going to go ahead and put the chip back down. So I'll show you cold soldering first. So as you can see, the chip has to be placed a certain way. We want to make sure that we're setting it on there properly. So to cold solder, all we have to do is place it as best as we can. And then we just come in with the heat gun. You can even try to hold it in place. You want it as dead center as possible. Now if you do this right, you won't have to actually add or remove any solder. There should still be plenty on there. Now while it's melted, we don't want to shift the chip around. And I'll show you after I do a hot solder. See how they kind of get bulbous when it's nice and melted instead of flat? And then I let it go for a little longer, just a few extra seconds, making sure everything's completely melted. Let it cool. As you can see, the shiny now turns dull as it dries. All right, now that we have the chip seated, we want to go ahead and test it. And as you can see, it's going to be a little low. That's because it's hot, and as it cools down, it'll come back to range. All right, so that was properly reseated. We'll go ahead and do a hot solder. So that was an example of cold solder. You can always add some more flux, but when you do, make sure to remove your heat. You don't want to put it directly on your applicator. So you can literally get right on the chip. Just want to be very careful of these small components here, because those are easy to bump and they'll just blow away real easily. Now I'm seeing it turn nice and shiny, so it's about ready. All right, roll it up. And then you can bring the heat away a little bit. Try to angle it down as best as you can. And that would be hot soldering. See how those are starting to become more bulbous? They're not as flat and long. They're kind of sucking up into the chip. That's what we want. Want to keep adding heat to it, because as soon as we set that cold chip down, it solidified all that solder. And there you have a solder job. Again, we're going to want to go in and test it. So as you see, it's not fully set properly because we have it too high here. So we're going to want to redo it. Now we want to be careful not to shift it around, because if you do, all that solder will become flat. You can bump components really easily. And now we'll have to reattach solder because there's no more solder left on those pads. It all got absorbed into this center pad. So always cleaning. Now there's a couple ways, a few different ways we can go about doing this. One way is to use just solder. The other way we can do this, what I like to do, don't know if we can get this on camera. All right, so what I also like to do is that you can take your solder paste, then you can take your flux, about a 50-50, maybe a little bit more solder than flux, and then you just mix it. This will help thin out the solder. And we'll come back in. All right, then we'll come back in with this solder flux mix. If you accidentally put too much, you can always bring it back into this big ground pad right here, because the excess will get absorbed into it. All right, so now we'll bring in our heat gun. We're going to have our tweezers ready. So we got some solder bridges in there. We want to get rid of those so we can bring in our tweezers and just kind of separate them. It'll cause a short circuit on the ASIC chip if you leave the solder bridge. Yeah, and then you can see right here that we have a little extra on the pad, so we can melt it and just use our tweezers to flatten it out. There we go. Now we'll go ahead and place the ASIC chip. Oh no. Got a little solder ball right here. Other side's got a little extra right there, so we'll go ahead and try to remove that excess. There we have it. You can go ahead and clean the area. Little 99% isopropyl alcohol.
One more time, sorry. Rock and roll.
Need to keep adding alcohol. All right, let's go ahead and give her a test. Again, make sure you're putting the red on the ground. If you do it backwards, you'll get a faulty reading. So that one's a little high. We're going to have to reflow it. So when you are reworking anything, I like to call it the 3 R's. So rework equals the 3 R's. And what that is basically you have reflow, reseat, and replace. And what reflow is basically you just add some flux, you melt all the solder past melting point for at least a little bit, and then you just let it cool back down. That's a reflow. A reseat, kind of like what it sounds like, you take the chip off, inspect everything, add some flux, put it back on. Then if that doesn't work, then you can use a replace. So what you do is obviously replace the chip. One thing you can do is you can switch ASICs from one domain to another, for example, see if that problem follows, or you can just take a used or new chip and just replace it. So we're going to go ahead and do a reflow on this chip. Hopefully we can get it back to range. Again, flux is our friend. Make sure we're using the right stuff. You don't want to accidentally put solder on there. If you accidentally put solder on here by accident, you'll end up having to remove all the excess solder. So another thing we can do is take our little magic sauce that's mixed with paste, solder paste, and we can add just a smidge in the general area. Hopefully that brought it back to range. There we go. All right, so now it's back in range.
What are we looking for to check for the range in terms of the numbers on the, is it voltage meter? Sorry.
Yeah, we're doing diode resistance tests.
Okay.
And while it's hot, it's going to be a little bit lower. But we want it to be about the same range as where we were when we started. So all right, so in this module, we're going to go ahead and do some ASIC placement practice. We're going to go ahead and take off the heat sinks for up to 12 different ASICs and just get your practice in on just taking them off, putting them back on. At the beginning, maybe just do like a good amount of them. Doesn't matter if you seat them properly. Just be sure you're doing your diode resistance before and after. And then we can go ahead, and once you get that habit of taking it off, putting it back on, you can even use the same ASIC and just keep taking it off, putting it back on to get that hand and eye coordination. But then we're going to want to try to get at least 10 of those 12, if not all of them, back into range, so that way we can have a good practice.